Welcome to our latest PFC webinar. Today we are introducing the inquiry draft of our new PFC Standard 1004, requirements for certification bodies providing sustainable forest management certification. I'm Hannah Prinz and I'm joined by Marta Martínez Pardo, our technical manager here at PFC International. Marta is going to be taking us through the new standard, which is currently under public consultation, highlighting some of the important elements, what's really important for you to know, and how you can take part in the public consultation. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A as we go along, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. So with that, let's get started. So Marta, could you give us a brief introduction to this new standard?
Thank you, Hannah. So the name of the standard already indicates this standard includes requirements for certification bodies providing audits against over-endorsed SFM standards, so the Sustainable Forest Management standards that PFC endorses and recognizes worldwide.
So is it fair to say this standard is really for certification bodies?
Yes, but I need to clarify. This is a hybrid standard. It includes requirements for certification bodies, but it also identifies a few requirements that need to be further developed at national level by our national certification or regional certification systems.
Mm-hmm. I think we will come back to this a little bit later, but maybe, as I've already mentioned the term, you could let us know what an inquiry draft is.
Of course, yeah, technical word. So, PFC follows different steps when revising documents. We have procedures that we need to follow when revising documents. To start with, we develop at working group level through multi-stakeholder groups. We develop different working drafts, so different drafts that are discussed among the stakeholders represented on the working group. At some moment of time, the working group agrees on a draft that goes for consultation, and that's what we call the inquiry draft.
Okay, I think that makes sense. Could you give us a bit of an overview of how the inquiry draft was developed?
Sure. The development of the inquiry draft followed the same procedures as any other standard revision or development of standards. So it's through multi-stakeholders engagement. We establish working groups, and within these working groups, and concretely this one, it's a temporary one, that where the different stakeholder groups that will be involved within this standard are represented.
So, as we've always said, stakeholder feedback, it's really critical in the development of any standard that we have. How did you go about it for this standard?
Indeed, stakeholders' feedback is vital for our standards. And the way we did it, we took over work that was already conducted in 2017, that we started conducting, and we further operate, we further work, and we consider all the feedback that within time we have been receiving from accreditation bodies, CVs, NGOs, some policies that may be relevant for us. We also look at the standard that we have with requirements for our chain of custody, and we try to incorporate all what was needed. So taking the different bits and really consolidating this inquiry draft through this feedback that we received.
I imagine a lot of work for the working group to get through, but really important.
Indeed, indeed.
You said during your answer that the development of this standard actually began in 2017 and then we had to have a brief pause. Were there any big differences between the draft started back then and the standard that we have now? I have heard that there was something regarding an ISO standard that certification bodies need to follow when implementing these requirements.
Thank you very much for this question, because it's indeed one of the main differences and one of the parts that has taken more time on the development of this inquiry draft. A few years ago, the PFC Board of Directors made a decision to go for management system with PFC Sustainable Forest Management. What does it mean? It means that forest management certification was based on the ISO/IEC standard 17021 management system. However, in the last years, we face a few challenges with our bigger accreditation body that decided not to provide accreditation services if PFC's decision of basing forest certification as management system remained, and this decision forced us to move to 17065, which is product certification. So what we did, let's say that it's a bit divided. There are some accreditation bodies that are clearly supporting 17021, so forest management is management certification, and a few others product certification. So what we did is making this standard compatible with both and ensuring that no matter which ISO standard you are basing your system in, you achieve the same result. So this is a benchmark requirement, and our national or regional certification systems need to decide whether they base certification body requirements in 17021 or 17065.
Thank you, Marta. I think that was a good explanation for what is quite a technical aspect of this new standard. I understand also that this document is really a first of its kind at PFC. It's using an innovative approach to make it a hybrid document, somewhere between a benchmark standard and also an international standard. Before, though, we dive really into that, I think it would be first useful for our listeners to explain what is the difference between a benchmark standard and an international standard.
Sure. Benchmark standards are those standards that we developed at PFC international level with requirements that the endorsed national, regional or subnational certification systems need to further develop and comply with. And the national systems, the endorsed certification systems, are assessed against those benchmark requirements in order to be recognized by PFC. International standard, an example of benchmark standard would be our SFM standard, the 1003, clear example. An international standard would be the chain of custody, which is a standard that includes requirements that are to be implemented directly by certificate holders. There is no intersection. So the certificate holders take the international standard and apply the requirements directly.
Mm-hmm. I know another term that is likely to come up quite a bit today is our bottom-up approach. This is something else you could give us just a quick explanation on?
Indeed, because the benchmark nature of our SFM standard is directly linked with this bottom-up approach. Why do we have SFM standards at benchmark standards? Because it's the way to ensure, on the one hand, that all our endorsed standards respond to the same requirements, but at the same time that they are developed, taking into account the local conditions and from the bottom. This is the way it works. Local stakeholders join in a working group and develop the SFM standard for the specific country or region. And they develop that one in compliance with the benchmark requirements. That's the way to listen to the local conditions, so adapt our SFM requirements to the local conditions and consider the local conditions in our SFM endorsed standards, at the same time as we build up something that is internationally applicable and understandable through our international benchmark requirements.
Thank you very much. So essentially, the hybrid approach that we're using for this standard is that it combines the benchmark requirements that have to be further developed at national level by our national governing bodies, and requirements that the certification bodies have to implement directly.
Yes, that's exactly the approach. You got it right.
Maybe you could let us know how this is actually going to work in real life.
Of course, yes. So, indeed, there are a few requirements identified within this draft standard that are benchmark requirements. And why? Why this hybrid approach? During the working group discussions, the working group identified that most of the requirements that need to be implemented by certification bodies during audits are in fact international requirements, and there is no much margin to adapt to the local conditions. Certain requirements, such as information that you need to receive during the application process, just to give you an example. It's the same no matter where you are based. And that's why the effort of the working group was put into harmonizing as much as possible the requirements that certification bodies shall follow during the SFM audits, at the same time as leaving some margin for these local conditions to be considered and be reflected. That's why we came up with this hybrid approach. We identified within the working group those requirements that are benchmark requirements and clearly need to be adapted to the local conditions, and the others are kept as international requirements.
So what would it mean if one of our national and governing bodies wants to establish higher requirements at their national level? Is this something they can still do?
Yeah, they can still go over the international requirements. That would be acceptable. That would not be a challenge, and it would be covered during our assessment processes. We need to ensure the minimum, and those requirements are the ones that are to be implemented globally, plus the benchmark requirements. At the same time, I need to say that maybe during the consultation, we discovered that there are a few other requirements that should be also adapted to the local conditions, and the working group overlooked. In that case, what we will do, the working group will consider feedback received and will make those requirements that right now are considered as international requirements into benchmark requirements. That's something 100% possible. And in fact, that's why I would like to invite everybody to please send us your feedback, because that's the feedback we need to be able to make this inquiry draft a better draft.
It's why the public consultation is really so important, and why we need as many people as possible to give their input.
Exactly.
Yeah. So now I think we can actually start to take a closer look at the structure of the standard. Could you let us know what the main chapters of the document are?
Sure. The structure of the standard, it's exactly or more or less the same as other standards, and it also follows the same structure as the existing standard we have with requirements for certification bodies providing chain of custody certification. So first chapter is the scope of the standard, second chapter normative references, third chapter terms and definitions, fourth chapter general requirements, fifth chapter resource requirements, and the sixth chapter is the one that slightly changed, so it doesn't follow the same structure as our standard for requirements for CVs for chain of custody, because it follows precisely the structure of 17021 and its information requirements. Chapter 7, process requirements, and we finish with the chapter 8, management system requirements plus the different appendixes.
And I know there are a lot of appendixes in this document. Are there any you would particularly like to highlight?
Yes, indeed. There are 6 appendixes. So it's quite a long document in terms of appendices. Those are all important, not that I want to highlight one more than the other, but there are specific ones that it would be very interesting to get feedback, so I would like to highlight those to invite you to provide feedback. And those are Appendix 1, that covers the requirements for certification bodies providing certification against group forest certificates. Appendix 4, where we are listing a list with applicable legislation for forest management. And Appendix 6, something new, requirements for auditors providing TOF certification.
TOF certification?
Good point. What TOF is. TOF means trees outside the forest. You may already know that during the last revision on the standard for sustainable forest management, PFC included a specific appendix with requirements for trees outside the forest, extending the scope to trees outside the forest. So this standard also includes requirements for certification bodies providing services against those TOF requirements.
Brilliant, thank you, Marta.
You're welcome.
I have also heard that this standard really pays special attention to data protection requirements. How is this approached?
Data protection became a topic, or has become a topic in the last years, quite an important one, and PFC is trying to integrate it within the standards that are developed or any technical documents that are revised quite actively. So what the standard considered is first that certification bodies shall comply with any applicable data protection legislation in the countries where they operate, and also soon PFC will be signing data processing agreements with the different certification bodies. This will be PFC Council, PFC International, which will be signing those different agreements with the different certification bodies.
Thank you. Regarding training, I know always an important subject for our certification bodies, the standard defines that auditors shall receive training recognised by the PFC Council. I know a few comments have already been received on this through the public consultation. Maybe you could elaborate on this a little more.
Of course, my pleasure. I would really like to explain this one because, as you mentioned, we already received a few comments. And I would like to make clear the intent is not suddenly to move training to international level and stop providing training on the endorsed systems by the national governing bodies. This is not the intent. What we want to do is trying to consolidate a training program and ensure that training is provided in a similar way. And there will be a part that will be international and another part that, of course, needs to be developed at national level or regional level by the national governing bodies. We will just combine both, and we will also have a knowledge test with questions on the international part, but also questions that will need to be developed by the national governing bodies. This is the approach that we are considering right now.
Thank you. Hopefully that has helped answer some of the questions and comments that we've been getting in. I think that Chapter 6, Information Requirements, particularly the section dedicated to the involvement of stakeholders, has been quite challenging. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about this?
Yes, indeed. That's a key point, and it has taken some time in the discussions, and I have seen that some of the comments are related to this specific section. What's the aim with this section is enable stakeholders to take somehow part within the certification processes, and that stakeholders' feedback is considered and listened. So this chapter tries to set up some requirements on how this should happen. The importance of engaging with stakeholders within the certification process, it's key, and it's something we have received feedback from different stakeholders. We consider it important, but I think that best is if I invite one of our stakeholders to talk a bit more about the importance of this engagement.
Hello, my name is Karen Steer, and as a member of the Accountability Framework Initiative, I wanted to share a few thoughts about the importance of involving stakeholders in the CB audit process. The Accountability Framework includes principles and guidance on independent verification of company performance relative to the company's sustainability goals. Stakeholder consultation is central to this assurance process because of the many values it brings. Stakeholder consultation allows auditors to gather information on company performance that either might not be detectable through other audit means or that is helpful for ground truthing or triangulation of that other information. It improves audit efficiencies by helping auditors prioritize based on risk, and it is fundamental for building trust and confidence with those who might be directly affected by company operations or those on the outskirts watching closely. These are just some of the reasons why stakeholder engagement has become firmly established best practice in rigorous and credible voluntary assurance schemes and in the expectations of buyers, investors, and others. If you have any questions about what the accountability framework has to say in terms of guidance and best practice around implementing stakeholder engagement, or any other ways in which we can help you to achieve your responsible supply chain goals, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
And we'd also like to invite Torsten Arndt, Head of Communications at PFC International.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, in fact, the involvement of affected stakeholders is something that has become increasingly important in the past couple of years. What we are always doing is we are monitoring what are the expectations of stakeholders that don't directly participate in our processes. And a range of organizations, of political institutions have highlighted how important it has become to involve stakeholders. What we also have to consider is that our standard will be there for years to come. So we don't only have to respond to the expectations that are there right now, but also to the expectations that will be there in 5 years, in 7 years, to ensure that we meet the requirements, the expectations that stakeholders have. And importantly, that they rightly have, because it makes the processes more robust.
Thank you very much, Dilston.
You're welcome.
And if we now move on to Chapter 7, Process Requirements, could you tell us a little bit more about the information that certification bodies shall collect from forest management certificate holders as part of the application?
Of course. So I guess no one will be surprised of the main information that is requested, such as corporate status or description of the certified area, the forest management documented procedures, information of the participants if it's a group forest certificate, information to assess whether it is a transfer from another CV and it's not a new certificate, if any consultants were involved within the implementation of the requirements by the certified forest owner or manager, that the consultants are also mentioned in this application, and any relevant information about the client organization, so the applicant, certificate holder, or its legal predecessor, whether they are participating in other, or they have participated in the last 5 years in other certification systems dedicated to forest management, either PFC or other certification systems. And in case that as part of this participation they may have received any change on the status, or any the certificate was suspended or withdrawn, or information related to this and to potential non-conformities.
That last point you mentioned regarding information on the client organisation or its legal predecessor, why is that important?
It's quite important because the standard also requires that during the application review, the certification body revise this information and needs to have different aspects into account. Being the main one, and why it's so important to receive information on the status of the certificate within other certification systems, is in case that the certificate was suspended or was withdrawn or terminated, what was the reason, if there were any non-conformities open, and if these open non-conformities could have an impact on the way the PFC requirements are going to be implemented by this applicant certificate holder. And this is important to assess this kind of impact.
I can see why that is so important and is something that we would need to know. Yeah. The standard clearly establishes the risk-based approach for the conduction of audits. Could you please tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. The standard establishes that the certification shall happen and shall take place based on risk-based approach, and already gives indicators that need to be considered when assessing the risks. However, the conditions for each indicator that the standard prescribes for the risks to be classified as low, medium, or high risk, these are to be defined by the national or regional certification system, because risks are different from one country to another. So the working group decided that this was one of the benchmark requirements. So the conditions for each of the indicators in order to classify the risk as low, medium, or high are to be defined by the national or regional certification system.
And what about audit times?
Another example of benchmark requirement, exactly the same. The regional or national certification system shall define within their national requirements the time to be allocated for the audits and the thresholds.
And something important for the world that we now live in, did the working group consider the new COVID reality and how remote audits could be conducted?
Indeed, this was discussed at working group level. We revised the PFC COVID guidance, and we also revised what other certification systems have been doing due to COVID. And we discussed, and we came up, the working group came up with a chapter for remote audits. We are looking forward to knowing what's the feedback on this concrete chapter with the remote. We are of course looking forward to receiving all feedback, but these remote audits, as it's something quite new after COVID, we are interested in, the working group would like to know how this has been received.
Yep, it would be great to get some comments on that for sure. Earlier we talked about data protection, but what about protecting the safety of the stakeholders?
Under the Chapter 8 management system, the standard requires that certification bodies put mechanisms in place to ensure that stakeholders and any person that wants to provide feedback, it can be concerns, complaints, it's protected.
For group forest certification, what kind of sampling is proposed?
That was another good discussion, and the way we manage it is that a few members from the working group work on this one specifically. The approach we came up with is that, as a minimum, a sample consistent on the number of participants equivalent to the square root of the total number of the participants audited during the internal audits, so we are linking the sample of the external audit with the internal audit somehow, needs to be audited individually at least once per year. And to go a bit further, and here the next benchmark requirement is coming, the working group decided that the size of the sample can be adapted by the regional or the national system. So we established the minimum sample, but it can be adapted by the endorsed national or regional systems.
And now I'm coming to my last, but definitely not least question, and that is the transition period for this standard. When does everyone start to use it? Maybe you could explain how the working group sees this happening.
Yeah, very good question. I guess that everybody is looking forward to having an answer, specifically our NGVs, but also CVs, accreditation bodies. So the way it was approached, and we will revisit it according to feedback received, but it's a 2 years transition period. First, giving 1 year to the NGVs to develop the national or regional requirements in such a way that they take, and the way this will be worked out, it's that the NGVs can take, our national governing bodies can take the standard. Those requirements that are international, they just need to take them as they are and incorporate them in their system-specific CVs requirements for SFM. Those requirements that are benchmark requirements are the ones that need to be developed and assessed. Once we have all the national systems in place, there is another 1 year for the certification bodies to get accredited and get used to the requirements and start implementing those requirements within the audit processes. That's what the working group had in mind. Maybe this needs to be extended another 1 year according to the feedback received, maybe less, but that's another example where your feedback is vital, and I would really like to invite you all to participate to support the working group in developing these requirements.
Great, so thank you, Marta, for telling us about the transition period. I think maybe the last thing to cover is actually what's next. What happens once the public consultation is over?
Once the public consultation will end, the working group will meet and discuss all the comments received and prepare a new draft. If with this new draft and the way the comments are addressed, the working group reaches consensus, we will get a final draft that will be submitted to the board. The board will be the PFC Board of Directors. The PFC Board of Directors will consider it, and if agreeing, will bring it up to the General Assembly for voting.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Marta. And it's been great for you to take us through this document so comprehensively. Thank you. We'd also like to thank all of you for joining us today. As Marta has said, please don't forget to give your feedback in the public consultation. Once again, the deadline is the 10th of January 2023, and this is really your opportunity to give your comments, give your feedback to help the working group ensure that this standard meets your needs and expectations. We would, of course, also like to thank the working group members for their dedication and their effort in developing this innovative document. Working groups, they're really at the heart of PFC and they are vital for the work that we do. So thank you from us. And now it's time for us to move on to the question and answer session of our webinar.